Welcome to the Enneagram 2.0 podcast. I'm Beatrice Chestnut.
And I'm Uranio Paes.
And today we are continuing to talk about the collective shadows of the Enneagram types.
And this is our last episode of a 4-episode series. If you haven't listened to the previous episodes, you suggest you do so, maybe in order. It will make a little more sense if you do so.
Yes, we've spent a little bit of time introducing the concept of the shadow for us individuals. But now, in this episode, we're talking about how shadows manifest collectively on a larger scale. And of course, when we don't work on our individual shadows, the energy of our shadow contributes to the collective shadows that are out there in the world, in the cultures and groups that we're connected to. And when we do work on our individual shadows, that helps ease the pressure of these collective shadows in the world.
Okay, great. So I think it's time for the heart triad. Let's briefly talk about the heart triad before we go to each type in that triad, okay?
So the shadow of the heart triad generally, and then we'll start talking about twos, threes, and fours.
Right, the collective shadow. So, yeah,
Right.
I would say that one important collective shadow of the heart triad is manipulation. It's the way of not really showing the truth. I think that to an extent, because these are more image based types and forces, because the 9 points in the Enneagram are not only types, they are 9 forces for many things. And they are more prone to forms of manipulation. And I think that is something that can have impact in different areas of society, in different things that are done or not done. And a second thing I would add is the image itself, because it's not only manipulation, then it's showing something that we are not, or pretending something, or coming up with an image that hides behind something different than that image. I think that that is very much seen in politics, for instance, but also in society as a whole. So, behind things like the excessive valuing of fashion, or the excessive problems we have, like I see how many teenagers nowadays have eating disorders. I think that this is somehow connected to all those shadows around the heart types. Would you add anything, B?
Yeah, I would think on the topic of manipulation, I think all the types can be manipulative, but in different ways. I think the heart types, for the heart types, the shadow might be more around emotional manipulation
Mhm.
or
Yeah.
manipulation of one's image, like you said, to create a false front. And I totally agree with you that I think a big problem in society today, like we talk about it a lot, like in social media, on things like Instagram and TikTok. There's a lot of people are presenting themselves to look a certain way, and a lot of those images are false, and so it sets up a lot of standard of everyone has to meet this kind of false standard of attractiveness or looking a certain way. And I do think that can be really harmful, and we often don't account for the harm those kinds of things do in different cultures.
Yeah, I would just add, some of the problems we see in social media right now, especially if you go to Facebook or to other social media platforms, you might feel depressed because people are just talking about the good things about their lives and not the bad things, right? And if
Right,
you're,
it stirs up envy and competition
yeah,
and because of
yeah,
how things look. And
right.
again, there may be a really happy picture of someone really beautiful, but that person may be very unhappy, and that's not showing in that picture.
Yeah, and then teenagers, for instance, might have trouble seeing that they think people are happier than them, while that might not be the truth. But anyway, let's talk about each type. And I think
Yeah,
you should start not only because you did the main body of the study, but also because you are a type 2.
right. So now remember, we're talking about shadows here. So we are looking a bit at the dark side of each type, and in terms of especially the way it shows up in society. Um, and of course, different cultures, different societies will have different shadows, and some of these things will be very present versus maybe different by culture. But a little bit basing this on my own culture of the US, I would say a collective shadow of type 2 would be what I call the romance industry. Kind of love sold as a commodity, or what might be more accurate, false love sold as a commodity. And I know a lot of twos themselves suffer from the fact that they have sort of been trained or programmed to uh, seek after fulfillment of romantic fantasies, of what's supposed to make you happy and what kind of relationship that you're supposed to have. And a lot of this can be based on a very superficial kind of definition of happiness or romance or connection or things like that. So, for instance, romantic fantasies manufactured to fuel sales of all kinds of goods and services, movies, magazines, the wedding industry, that you'll live happily ever after if you spend all this money having the fairy tale wedding, makeup, vacations, books, things like that. The romance industry, romantic getaways, things like that would be one example. And anything you would add to that?
Well, on that point, I think that the cult of aesthetics everywhere, like in my home country, Brazil, that is so big, like
Yes.
plastic surgery and people, doing many, many things and spending the money they don't have in products
Mhm.
that and treatments that bring you to supposedly what is considered by society a better model of beauty. And even in retreats sometimes that we do, I get surprised because when people deal with traumas and they feel really relieved, and they then many times they look younger, and sometimes people see that part of them looking younger than looking healthier. And I
Mhm.
think that's so interesting. We're all very much in the West, at least, based in appearance, image, and aesthetics.
Yeah, and I think a big underlying a core element of type 2 is the need to be loved, to feel lovable, and a lot of fear that I'm not lovable kind of thing. And I think what the advertising industry generally does in the West is to create false needs and then say, if you buy our product, you'll be lovable. You'll be attractive enough to be loved by people, or you'll smell good enough to be loved by people. And so I think there's that whole in their whole industries that are created to kind of sell products based on false needs and people's need to feel loved, or feel like they can achieve the connections that they want in their life. I have other ideas, but I want to remind people we're only talking about maybe one or two shadows per type. This is a work in progress, and we're kind of making a longer list, and we're planning on doing some events and courses on the shadow. But for now, maybe I'll stop there. I think too, there's a exchange mentality that twos have, and there can be shadows there. You know, codependence, those kinds of things. But just mention those for now,
Yeah.
and maybe we could move on to
Uh,
three, or anything else you want to add.
well, very quickly, in the exchange mentality, when that kind of reciprocity becomes many bad things that happen behind the scenes, and some not so civilized and good exchanges, that we see sometimes in politics, for instance, that agreements behind the scenes that are not the best. I think that might be present in this the shadows of point two for all of us. But
Mhm.
yes, let's
Right.
move on to three.
Well, actually, what we've been doing is then talking a little bit about the
Oh yeah,
positive things that can happen
yeah.
when we focus on integrating the
Mm.
shadow. Because the whole point of learning about the shadow is recognizing that we need to see and own and integrate our shadows in order to become more whole and more healthy and more in a place of acceptance and living more in real life. I think too, in terms of accepting all of who we are as individuals and cultures and groups, collectives. So I would just say, I think, in terms of what we talked about, in terms of the romance industry and advertising, I think when people are more realistic in advertising or when there's more ethics in both the products that get created and the sales messages associated with products, do people really need this? Is this really good for people? Bringing ethics into, in some ways, capitalism, in some ways, marketing and commerce, having a kind of ethical sense of, is something we're creating actually bad for people? Is it, having more of an ethical sense about social media, for instance, as we were talking about? Is this hurting teenage girls? And do we need to do something about that? Do we need to change and reform some of the practices of business and things like that so that the human element is taken into account? And I think also with the romance industry, um, focusing more on developing um, books, therapy courses, even products with thinking in mind of what's really good for people and what's really supportive of true connection. We have an epidemic in our society of people not finding ways to truly connect, and when that happens, when people can't connect in healthy ways, leads to suicide and addiction and all kinds of things, social ills. So bringing in sort of mental health um, education into business, into advertising, into uh, giving people options based on what's really healthy and what helps people thrive and truly connect. It might be more education about intimacy and connection and relationship. It might be more realistic depictions of relationships in the media that help people learn about how to create resilient connections, not just how to look good so you'll attract someone and that's the end of the story.
Yeah, I would add just one more positive thing when we do our work on this Enneagram point two, and that is seeing people that are usually ignored by society. Having not only the respect, but the actual attention and care for people who are usually underprivileged.
Yeah, exactly. And you know being more real about what love really is and what it isn't, because I think when we're selling false love and we're only making people's fears and anxieties about being seen and loved worse, and that leads to a lot of especially mental health issues and difficulty for people. But let's look at type three. Examples of collective manifestations of the type three archetype shadow. Um, and again, here I'm basing this a little more in my own country because this is what I know. But I think America is a type three country, so I think we need not look very far to find some good examples of the type three shadow in American culture, but of course it will be in other cultures around the world to some extent. And that's sort of like corporate America and the kind of corporate view of life, capitalism, and especially the consumer culture or mercantilism, the marketing mentality. I think Claudio Naranjo sometimes calls three sort of the marketing approach or the marketing attitude. It's like about selling. So the over focus on success, but not just success as defined in a particular way, of making a lot of money and having a lot of things. And I'm always surprised by stories of people in the US, like celebrities or people that or business people who make a lot of money. And then at some point they lose it all because they kept needing to buy more and more things, like a bigger house and a nicer car, and instead of just feeling like, okay, this is enough. And I think what goes along with that is competition, like needing to compete with other companies, with other people, the need to deliver results at any cost, the idea of profit over people. So there's so many examples of, like in our country, the pharmaceutical industry, the Sacklers and the opioid crisis getting caused by a pharmaceutical company that only wanted to make money and totally in some really scary ways, really, hid what their drugs were doing, hooking people and taking advantage of people's, making people addicted and then saying it wasn't addicted, and making a lot of money and totally disregarding people. Anytime in sort of American business or capitalism where it's all about the money, it's all about corporate interest, it's all about what the shareholders get. We've had a recent derailment, and in the train industry, for instance, instead of making trains safer, and this is even commercial trains and transport, there was a clawback, and even that word clawback, which is when shareholders in a company, you know, get more money out of the company for themselves instead of reinvesting money in the company to like make things safer, to make things better for people around the train routes. And then and because of these clawbacks of the shareholders just getting more money out of the business, and because of like things like deregulation where they don't have to pay as much for safety, they're just getting the money for themselves, not thinking about safety, not, this just happened with bank foreclosures, the leaders in these banks like taking a bunch of money for themselves right before the bank collapses. When that happens, I think to myself, how can people do this? Like, how is there no sense of interest or care about the people who are being harmed by your sort of, your sort of I don't know if this is the wild capitalism you mentioned in the last episode, but this sort of out of control self-interest and success and competition and making money at any costs. And this might include pesticides that are sold, and that people are getting cancer from these pesticides, and there's no regulation. Nobody sees that and stops it from happening. And again, the primacy of selling, conspicuous consumption, like selling more each time. A lot of companies each quarter they need to sell more without considering, like, is it good for people to sell more? Are we making enough money? All of these kinds of things. It's a little bit similar to what we talked about for type 2, but I think a little bit more on the kind of growth for growth's sake.
Mm.
And in addition to creating fake needs to sell products, it's more the whole industry of making money, achieving success at any cost.
Yeah, very good points. Yeah, I see all of that also behind consumerism and distorted beliefs that get created of what happiness is. That happiness has to do with having, right, and not with being. But yeah, and also, the how much all of us act in fake ways when we go to society, and even more especially on social media, right? It's very rare to find pure sincerity when you are on social media. And then
Or
perhaps,
to know whether there's sincerity or not, you know?
yes, yes, yes. Right. And then one thing that's definitely not only here on point three, but it is there here too, which is potential for fraud that
Mm,
people
yes.
can't see or can't really easily uncover. So I think that that is a big shadow potentially for this point where all of us can touch base with self deceit and deceit.
Yeah, yeah,
What
that's a really good one.
and
Really important.
what would be, in your view, the good sides when we do work on that point three in all of us? What could be examples of positive outcomes?
Well, I think we're seeing this in America in some ways, certainly not enough, but some, and hopefully we'll go more in this direction, but like responsible capitalism, conscious cultures and companies who very self-consciously and intentionally incorporate human values into their business practices. And the interesting thing is, I think there's research out there showing that companies actually make more money sometimes. They're more successful when they do this, but it's a little bit like living more in line with their deeper human values. It's a little bit like threes when they get in touch with their true self. And at first, a three will be sort of worried, like, well, if I get in touch with how I really feel, what I really want, will I be less successful? Will I have to give up all the rewards that my ego or my personality brought me through the drive to be successful and compete to win, etc. But I think it's actually often true for threes that when they're living more in touch with who they really are, what they really want, even if it might entail changing their lives in ways that are at first scary, eventually they find actually things work much better, especially in terms of being more happy and being more rooted in a deeper experience of life. And I think the same is true for, say, corporations or the collective. It's like having more sustainable companies, that are more environmentally conscious, that aren't destroying the environment, which are people's homes sometimes, to sell products in an unrestrained way, having more sustainable practices, giving back to the community, making sure that you're having a kind of human connection to your audience, your community, to the people you're selling to, and that you're actually making their lives better as opposed to just making money. And I'm having more honest communication in providing information about goods and services, and doing marketing, creating and distributing products and services based on real needs and what's good for people, and production tied to values and what lifts people up. So, for instance, I would love it if we would get rid of corporate farming, and harming animals, because it's cheaper and the company makes more money. That's why I don't eat a lot of meat myself, but when I do, I always buy, even if it costs a little more money, I'll just eat less if I can't afford it, because I think, the fact, knowing that the business practices of the business that you're interacting with come from real humans who are taking care to consider the well-being of both people and animals and the planet. I think all of those things can be really shifted if we're more aware and more conscious of the big shadow of sort of normal corporate business as usual.
Right. And now people talk about greenwashing a lot, as in, companies, many companies that just act like they are sustainable versus true sustainability, which is
Right,
deeper.
fake sustainability, acting
Right.
like you're more philanthropic than you are, that you're more sustainable, that you're caring more about the planet, which of course would be another great example of this shadow. I'm going to act like I care about you, but I really don't. I'm acting like, and which is kind of sometimes threes when they first learn the Enneagram, it can be a little bit an upgrade of their image as opposed to, getting away from the image. And I think greenwashing is a really good example of that, like looking like we're green, but really we're not. We're just trying to sell more because you think we're green and environmentally conscious.
Yeah, and
Good example.
then yes, and as part of this point three, I think there is the potential for realizing how being is way more important than having for happiness, true happiness, and in a more joyful life, actually, not only happiness. And I want to mention this study that is done every year by the UN, ranking countries in terms of the happiness levels. And Finland has just been voted for the sixth year in a row as the happiest country. And then they explain why. And every little thing that is said is um, inner work that needs to be done on point three. So they have a chilled out way of life, more relaxed. They are more cooperative and less competitive. They don't have expectations that are big for their lives and goals. And they don't worry as much about what the outside world thinks of them. And it's not only about low criminal levels or, education, which is great there, but it's also a lot about this kind of things.
Yeah, and I think in the US, for instance, it's still sort of an admirable thing to be a workaholic, you know?
Mhm.
It's not really seen always as a problem that it really is. But I think things are changing a little bit because the more we learn about burnout and stress and
Yeah,
how unnecessary it really is and how sometimes it's caused by this striving for this ideal image of success that is in many ways ephemeral. It's not real. We kind of drive ourselves crazy at trying to attain something that isn't good for us anyway.
great.
And that's hopefully changing more and more. Hopefully, and
Yeah.
especially as this shadow gets more understood. Okay, so and I think when people talk about work-life balance, for instance, that's a good
Hmm.
sign that that type 3 shadow is getting seen and um,
Hmm.
integrated. Shall we talk about the type 4 shadow in the collective?
Sure.
So here I would say, um, in some ways, it's a little bit one of the things that came to me was the failure. And again, here I'm mainly talking about the US, and I apologize for that. My intention isn't to be so ethnocentric. I just think it's easier for me to talk about some shadows in a clear way, talking about the culture I know, but certainly we can find this in cultures around the world in different ways. But here in the US, I'd say there's something about the failure of the mental health industry to be seen as in some ways like on par with physical health industry. There's a way that it's still seen as kind of bad if you go to therapy or if you have a mental health condition, if you're depressed, if you're anxious, there's something wrong with you. You're judged. And it reminds me a little bit about how fours tend to be in touch with the shadow itself. Fours tend to be more in touch with pain and suffering and emotions, a wide range of emotions. And in a way, in fours, that's a really positive thing, but it gets seen as a negative. And partly because in many cultures it's seen as bad to be too emotional or too dramatic or to feel things deeply. And so it tends, so what we see in fours is sometimes an inferiority complex or a superiority complex. And of course we always say underneath every superiority complex is an inferiority complex, and underneath every inferiority complex is a superiority complex. And here in the US, of course, part of what the effects of what we just talked about, this sort of the fact that there's a cultural ideal of success, of what you need to look like to be acceptable. If you don't conform to that somehow, you're seen as less than. And I think there's an epidemic of inferiority complex in this country. I mean, I know very few people who I would say don't have low self-esteem of some kind. And I think the type 4 archetype kind of shows us a person who sort of over identifies with there's something wrong with me, or my emotions, and there's something wrong with me being in touch with emotions. Like people will, in some ways, criticize people who are emotional. And again, it can be a very healthy thing to be in touch with your emotions, to be emotionally sensitive, and to, for instance, go to therapy to get, not because there's something wrong, but because you want to be a healthier, more integrated person, psychologically, emotionally. And yet, a lot of people are really say that that's not a good thing. So, anytime people are actually in touch with their deeper feelings, they might need help with that. They might like people who acknowledge that they're depressed and seek help for that. That's a positive thing, right? And there's good reasons to be depressed in our world today. And yet, often I think there's a part of what helps cause depression is a misunderstanding of what it means to be emotional or emotionally healthy. And there's still a stigma against going to psychotherapy and taking care of your emotional and psychological health. And I think there's a way that type 4 kind of represents a kind of a person who sort of stands for the value of emotions and emotional intelligence, but they often get demonized or put down for that, because people don't want to be reminded about emotions, or they immediately think if someone's sad that that's a bad thing. And fours are kind of more okay with authentic emotions. But another thing I would put on the list of, a possible, what's possibly, a shadow connected to type 4 is that there aren't enough resources for lifting people up, for helping people see who they really are and that they're valuable, because fours have this sort of sense of inner deficiency. And I think that sometimes there is a reaction to this that can be what I call toxic positivity, right? Like you're just supposed to be happy, like you're just supposed to deny deny your feelings, and get over it. And I think that can be also problematic. But also, there is a way that people, when they're suffering, they may have a hard time finding help. They may have a hard time getting the support that they need to understand their suffering and work their way out of it in a healthy way, which is why part of why we have a high suicide rates, high rates of addiction, because these things are often ways of trying to escape from pain. And I think in the West, we don't have a culture that understands the nature of emotional and psychological pain. It's sort of like if you have a pain, a physical pain, you go to the doctor. There's no stigma against that. If you're in emotional pain or psychological pain, it's good to get help. And yet, a lot of people don't want to admit that. They feel bad about themselves because of that. And there can even be, also, in another topic, kind of an attachment to victimhood or oppression, and not finding ways to solve that.
Right. Yeah, I want to mention a few things. I think in today's society, there is this tendency of everybody lacking satisfaction. Nothing's enough. And I think that comes a little bit from a collective mindset that something's missing. And
Yes.
that's connected to point four. But also, point four's passion is envy. And I think that from a collective standpoint, envy creates bad things like bullying coming from envy, or even things like a big hierarchy in society, in social um, status, or things like caste. I think that that has to do with this imbalance of how I see others and myself, and this
Some people are
tendency.
better than others somehow.
Right. Yeah. The superiority and inferiority complex, which are actually one complex. So, yeah. But then we might want to talk about positive outcomes when we work on that.
Yeah, so when the shadow is integrated, for one thing, I would love to see a more well functioning, um, really substantive mental health industry where it's really accepted that every many people, most people might need therapy at some point in their lives, and that's not doesn't necessarily mean there's something wrong with you. So having better forms of therapy, I know, for instance, in a lot of like healthcare organizations, like here in the US, we have a lot of problems in our healthcare system. But like if you have insurance, insurance may not pay for any psychotherapy, or it might pay for only a few sessions, or only for a certain reason, or only from certain people, and they don't pay the therapist very much. So there's a lot of, I think it would be great if we could reform the helping industry or the healthcare industry around mental health, having more like for instance, I think a lot of some of what's a really positive in where people can get help, for instance, are 12-step programs, right? And those operate very much often outside of the sort of healthcare system. That's something that was started by two individuals, and it's often kind of a grassroots experience that a lot of people get a lot out of. Al Anon, AA, recovery groups like that. But what about bringing that more into the mainstream? Having more good psychotherapists and having more accessible psychotherapy for people at different income levels, for different reasons. I mean, right now, I mean, I think one of the positive outcomes of COVID actually in our country was that more people got to the point where they were really feeling so much suffering that they asked for help. And I think asking for help and getting a therapist is becoming more normal. It's like sort of normal to be anxious. It's normal to have different problems that came out of COVID, whether it's marital issues because you were inside, or family problems, or children are having issues, teenagers that didn't get to go to school. And it's sort of more common to look for a therapist, but there's a shortage of therapists. Every therapist I know, psychotherapist, and I'm a psychotherapist, all the people I know that I trained with are all full, all the good psychotherapists. And it's really hard to find a place there. So having a better system where there's more acceptance of all the emotions of pain, and there's more understanding in collective society that that's to some degree a normal part of being human, and that there are a lot of things you can do to learn to feel better about yourself, to heal, to grow, to learn to see things in a way where it's not just about what's missing or what you don't have, or a standard in society that's sort of fake that you're not meeting. So more understanding about how to work through psychological issues, which could include more support for parents on parenting, or what to do when your child is having an issue, on how to have good, meaningful, deeper relationships based more on being vulnerable with each other, on what it takes to heal trauma, and more places to go to heal trauma. I think if you think about even like people who are in jail, like incarcerated, who have committed crimes, what huge percentage of those people did what they did because of trauma, because they never had any access to support, to heal, to grow, to learn that there was nothing wrong with them, that they were just suffering. And that a lot of, I think, crime is a way of people acting out and not knowing how to get help. So all of these kinds of things, I think, could be a great way of kind of integrating that the shadow that type fours hold. It's a little bit tricky because for fours, those aren't shadows. For fours, they're very aware of that this sort of emotional, psychological way we are as a culture. But in a way, what their shadow tends to be is feeling bad about themselves for that. So ways to feel good about who you are without seeing yourself as more than or less than anyone else. Self-esteem training.
Yeah, I think when we overcome these point four shadows, we may stop pathologizing everything and taking things, some more things as being normal, and like as in even celebrating differences.
Yeah.
And but what I really want to add here is that healthier force, and when we all collectively deal with the point four issues, bring to equality and also to inclusion with true respect and love and capacity to see that everybody is deserving.
Mhm. Right, exactly. Exactly. And how to feel good about yourself, how to really get at a deep level that you are special, but so is everybody else, you know? And I think in our, I mean, I just, you just don't, I don't know anyone who hasn't suffered with low self-esteem. And so finding more ways to integrate into our culture opportunities for people to learn to feel good about themselves and not focus on what they don't have or what's wrong with them, again because of an implicit comparison to everyone else, that and an image, a false image of what they're supposed to be.
Right, so let's move on to the head triad and start talking about the triad itself, first five, sixes, and sevens. So I think one collective shadow here is arrogance that comes both from the head believing in superpowers that perhaps as if superpowers didn't exist in the heart or the gut. So it's a superiority complex that is very typical for head people. And I think that has been viewed um, over centuries of, um, all of us thinking that rationality was more important than other things. And how many things are based in that, like sometimes the arrogance of science also, of
Yes.
not knowing that there are other ways of knowing and not valuing those and sticking to some methodologies, not all of science, but some people who are more resistant to even more flexible methods in science itself, then people think that nothing else is valid, invalidating everything else. And then logic as a means for bad things. Uh, Sometimes logic is not as logical as we think. It's self-serving people, and we can very easily manipulate conclusions if we are just based in the head. Also, getting to positions that deep down are not caring of people, and not really based in what is generosity. People who are very mental do have that risk, run that risk. But I think that as a society, when we are too mental, that becomes a collective issue. And sometimes also not allowing for things that are um, more difficult to be explained, and both in interpersonal connections but also in educational systems. I think that the bad impact of the excessive mind energy in education is where it concerns me the most, We don't really help kids learn how to be and learn how to relate and to do as much. It's much more about just understanding and the IQ being above other, like EQ or other forms of intelligence. Would you add
Right, yeah,
anything?
exactly, the superiority, the implicit superiority of the intellect, or being rational over being emotional or being instinctive, and the how that's prioritized and the negative effects of that. And how I think, again, that's a lot of how some people end up feeling bad about who they are, having low self-esteem is like, well, I'm not smart enough, or and sometimes that's just head type versus heart type versus body type. And the virtue of the Enneagram is to see these different kinds of functioning as equal, not one better than the other. But I do think in a lot of cultures, it's seen as there's a superiority of the intellect. Yeah.
So, what do you think are collective shadows based on point 4b? On point 5, sorry.
So I think the type 5 shadow, when we look at it in the collective, and I really want to hear from you on this. And I remember one time when we presented this, I think it was the first time we presented this to a retreat. Um, you added a lot to this one. So
Mm.
we're not naming too many shadows today, maybe just a few, but I just want to say that I know that you thought of a lot on this one. So I think that when fives, even more so than the triad of head types, really has a kind of shadow of prioritizing the intellect and in some ways advocating for or supporting the disconnection from emotions. And when this happens, there's a focus, like an over focus on things like mechanization, automation. You get sort of a kind of rigid science without any sense that spirituality is real, a kind of dogmatic, rigid thinking about what has truth value, um, and maybe sort of the rise of artificial intelligence without humane values, and the kind of glorification of whatever's mental or intellectual or rational, and the devaluing of emotions and emotional connection. And I think sometimes that's part of what's beneath the sort of the mental health crisis or the crisis of connection in our society. It's like people can't connect and they don't know. And if they can't, they just think there's something wrong with them. They sort of, because there's a way that it's been normalized in a way. Like it's just people don't think there's places to go or things they can do to learn to connect, to find the connection they want, and they end up being kind of too isolated and too alone. What would you add?
Okay, so I think I think that fives sometimes create models that make sense and they get really excited with the models themselves, but only that those models are not always good for people. But they don't see that, either a blind spot or even a big shadow of not looking into that more closely. And that can be found in theories for organizations and how they can change, and then talking about things that will lead to mass dismissals, firing lots of people, but that makes sense, so that's the good thing. And the rationale behind some ways that the financial market works, or above all, in my view, algorithms right now from social media and how they collect information about you and how that's used in very sophisticated ways, that you talk about something nowadays and then all of a sudden your phone starts showing you advertisement on the thing that you're talking about. So the surveillance systems, not as much for security, that would be perhaps 6, but in that way of using information in ways that are not the best, and even experiments with animals or humans for the sake of science or developing something, but without much um, care, love, and concern, true concern with people.
Right. Yeah, I think you could probably go on and on. So to be continued at some point, but yes, I think we've named some really important ones. Yeah. So integrating this shadow of type 5, how can we see some examples of positive outcomes?
Are you asking me? Do you want me to start?
I guess I can start and
Okay,
then love to
please
hear
go
what you
ahead.
have to say. So I think, we have in the last, I want to say at least 10 years, there has been a movement toward kind of the body mind connection, toward approaches to growth and healing that acknowledge mind, body, heart, and spirit. That these are all parts, different dimensions of us, of humans. And so I think like having a more values based science, for instance, public policy that's driven more by humane values, how people feel about things, not causing suffering, and putting together quantitative and qualitative approaches, not always having be everything be just about the intellectual level of it. um, you know allowing for more education and more focus on connecting with emotions and connecting with people and connecting emotions and people with how we think as well, seeing the whole system together as being important for um, understanding how things happen or how we create new things or how we live together in relationship, that we need each other in a way. Sometimes I think there's that tendency to um, minimize the value of human connection, of love, and what comes from a really supportive, nurturing relationships. It's sort of like the idea of, well, I'm more comfortable off on my own, and I think if we provide more ways of connecting on all levels for people, and again normalize that in our world, then I think it takes away some of this rigid way of thinking that's more focused on thinking.
Right, I guess that it's using knowledge in service of and with empathy, and with excellence also. Achieving excellence in producing knowledge, but for the right objectives, and taking into account what is super important, the more human side of things, but also using knowledge in ways that are more cooperative, uh, like Wikipedia or blockchain technology, and of course education as a whole as something that needs to be not only spread around to everybody in better ways, and helping people think for themselves and not just fall into fake news, but also quality of education. Let's move on to type 6. What would you say are collective shadows coming from that type?
So I think one collective shadow connected to the type 6 is authoritarianism. And this is the idea that when fear dominates a collective, a country, a group of people, it contributes to creating a more hierarchical worldview. Fear has a lot to do with authority, right? Sixes tend to have authority issues, either really wanting a good authority, a sort of archetypal father figure to come in and save us and protect us and provide a strong presence in the face of all the things we're afraid of, or skepticism of power, and that's fear of the other. Six is fear of the other, which might mean, examples of that in our world today is the way authoritarians actually use xenophobia to get people to go against each other, and give more power to the authority. So, fear of the other and a desire for a protective authority, a fantasy that this authoritative leader, this strong person, will come in and do all we need for us, which can lead to becoming a true believer, which is something that social sixes in particular are in risk of. Like, we'll become a true believer in this powerful authority, and then we'll give over all our rights to that authority, so they'll take care of us, and not seeing the downside of the authority in power, potential problems with the authority and power, the way that they may be taking control out of self-interest as opposed to a true caring for the people, the way they may be just wanting power for power's sake, for themselves, and not really being for the people or the country. So that kind of thing. I'll stop there and see what you have to say, because I think sixes see the world through power, a lens of power dynamics.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah, and with all that you said, I think that it comes a little bit from that point six. Bad things that might happen, like bad forms of riots or fighting people collectively, and going against too much when you don't agree, and forms of nationalism.
Yeah, excessive nationalism is a good example of one form of it. Can be an example of the defense mechanism of splitting,
Hmm.
right? So we make our team all good and the other country or the other team all bad.
Hmm.
So then we get really nationalistic, um, and we see ourselves as good or heroic, and that builds a rationale on which we can attack or demonize the other group, the other country. And sometimes that's how authoritarians rise. And we've seen many instances in history where authoritarians gain power through nationalist movements, and then they don't do good things with that power. They can then have the power to oppress people. They can have the power to, create a lot of problems. But again, there is this sort of shadow six thing of um, making some people good, some people bad, and then that becomes a reason to take action against some people when we and support an authority that uses power too much.
And I want to add one more, which is fundamentalism. I think it's a
Mm.
shadow coming from point six, and it exists nowadays in all religions. And it's one of the big problems in society, in my view. And people like voting out of fear, So things that I believe we need to work on as part of the point six in all of us. But what would be good outcomes when we do work on point six B?
So I think good outcomes when we integrate this shadow is um, other forms of leadership that don't rely on investing all our trust in a particular authority. Um, Now, I think there needs to be room for understanding that there are many forms of government or society that are valid. I don't want to be here saying like democracy is the only good way, but there is that saying that it's the best form of government except for all the others. But enlightened leadership, like, if you do have an authority, how do you ensure that authority is going to act in the service of the people and not just in service of themselves or a small elite group of people? So having enlightened leadership, sharing power somehow, having checks on authorities, and ways that they're in some ways encouraged or enforced to act in the collective interest as opposed to self-interest, and that they don't misuse their power. Feedback systems, ways of being flexible to meet the needs of the people, of the citizens, and in some ways having a little more decentralized power. And sometimes it can be a balance in different ways, but not going too far to one side of having an authoritarian environment where some people are made the other, and there's a heroic leader who gets given all the power and then has the potential to misuse it. I also think, if we think of the type 6 authority issue as in some ways coming from uh, the first the first authority, the father, the archetypal father, and the father wound. There may be a way that healing that father wound, so we're not out there looking for a father. So it might even be like greater resources and education for people to be able to become their own authorities, to be empowered, and balancing things like nationalism and patriotism with higher human values like love and equality, friendship, understanding globalism and that it's not taking everything away from you or creating immigration situations where you're going to lose what you have. So, better education systems, better human support systems, and things like ombudsmen or whistleblowers,
Yeah.
compliance departments, ways of enforcing limits on the power of the authority, and seeing people as all having power and authority in their own lives.
Yeah, you said all that I was going to say gladly, and I can add only, regulatory agencies, the role
Yeah,
of them in different societies, and they fit right into all government systems. I think that's brilliant, and it's a good way to go using well the point six energy.
yeah, great.
So let's move on
Shall we
to
move on to type
seven.
7?
Yes, please.
Okay, so collective example of the type 7 shadow, when not integrated. I think a big one is, and this is a general category, but of course there can be examples and subcategories, and that is corruption, in politics and business, when excessive self interest, sort of, I'm going to get mine, leads to the undermining of public institutions, of trust in public groups. And when leaders don't believe in anything beyond self interest. I mean, there's so many examples of different governments around the world that have really become corrupt, um, in different institutions in different countries. In some countries, the police are corrupt. In some countries, the prison system is corrupt. In some country, the government is corrupt. In some countries, the president of the country is corrupt. And usually it comes down to I don't want any limits on my power, especially my power to get what I want for myself. Right. So, and again, I never understand. And maybe this is because I have a big social instinct myself, even though it's not my dominant one. But how could you be a political leader and steal all this money when it's going to have a huge negative impact on thousands of people, maybe millions sometimes? Like, why would you just put yourself ahead? Like, to me, even just as a regular human, it just doesn't make sense, but it happens all the time. And it's almost like it's looking out for myself, full stop, end of story. And I think often this leads to different kinds of, I mean, in the US, in our government, in some ways we have legalized corruption, right? People stop being a congressperson and they go work for a lobbyist, and then they make money influencing what the group they were just part of. People in our government, trade and make money in the stock market based on inside information they get through governing. And all of these are examples of sort of legalized corruption. And it has such far reaching negative effects. People don't trust government anymore. They don't trust anyone in position of power. And when that happens, there's a lot of bad things that can unfold from that. So I would say corruption. I do want to mention one other thing, but then I want to hear what you think, and that is some forms of positive psychology. Some forms of positive psychology or self-help approaches that overemphasize the power of positive thinking. I think sometimes those kinds of approaches deny the shadow. They want to deny pain. They don't want to acknowledge the painful side of life in some ways that sevens do. And I just think that the only way to alleviate suffering is to acknowledge it and address it and process it and work through it. And some of these approaches, not all, I think there are some positive psychology approaches that take the sort of painful parts of life into account. But there are many that don't, that the just be happy kind of approach. And then there are whole systems or ideologies built around the denial of the shadow of what's negative, of pain and difficulty. And I just think that that's actually perpetuates suffering. And I think there's a lot of this in Western culture that because we don't have ways of dealing with pain.
Yeah. Yes, I think that in a broader way, I would talk about toxic positivity in general, and also easy wins for coming from the seven mentality in all of us, without effort, or things like Ponzi schemes, or just collectively, how many emperors in the past would follow the policy of bread and circus. It's a little bit like the seven thing and
What's
charlatan.
bread and circus for people who may not know, including me?
Yeah, like in old Roman society, some emperors would just control the population dissatisfaction, giving them two things: bread and circus,
I
because
see.
then they would be okay, they won't complain as much. And that is a policy of making people happy, and then we can
Yeah.
keep doing what we are doing. And
Yeah.
like charlatanism, I think that's something else that might come. I remember Naranjo associated charlatanism more with the sexual seven subtype, but it's
Mhm.
something that all sevens and the seven in us might. We all need to look into that.
Mhm. Mhm.
And
Yeah.
the good outcomes when we all do work on all this.
Yeah. So when we can integrate this type 7 shadow collectively, I think what can happen from that is reforms and rules that regulate systems and institutions that ensure ethical behavior. Institutional safeguards against people following their own self interest without limit. I mean, again, in the US, what's really scary is that there aren't a lot of ways sometimes to stop someone who's doing that. And as I said before, some forms of it are kind of legal, which is why there are so many people dissatisfied with institutions and government. And then people get cynical and they don't even want to vote. So I think, but if we have social norms, but not only social norms, but methods of accountability, whistleblower protections, regulations. A lot of, some of our banks, a couple of banks just failed a few weeks ago. And what do you know? A few years ago, politicians lobbied to take away some of the regulations that had been put in place on banks after the 2008, breakdown. And it's like, okay, as soon as things get a little bit better, take away the regulations, take away the oversight. Don't look what we're doing. Let us do whatever we want with our businesses or our country, with our companies. And there's so much pressure put on government to let people do whatever they want, to regulate themselves or do, exist without any kind of regulation in the public interest. And guess what? Every time you can't trust them. People can't be trusted to regulate themselves. They can't be trusted not to have excessive self interest and to, play games. And then the whole system collapses and hurts a lot of innocent people. Making sure people understand, and again, I think this also means like educating the populace more about all of this, so that we can create a system with regulation and oversight, but also systemic rewards and incentives for collective action in service of all the people, not just the wealthy or privileged. One of the real problems in Western society is the inequality of wealth in many countries. And when that happens, it leads to all kinds of social problems. And so elitism, I think, might be part of this. And so making sure that the system, the institutions work for the collective and work in service of all the people, not just one group or another, so that things can't be tilted in, so that some people can't enrich themselves through selfishness and greed at the expense of others simply because they want more pleasure and freedom and power for themselves.
Yeah, I think that I would add, the mindset of each person needs to do their part, and that includes me, with accountability, commitment, congruence, like walking the talk. This is a good consequence when we do work on the seven in all of us, and also productivity, focus.
Yeah, yeah. And not just being about happiness and freedom, individual for an individual, there be sort of individual happiness being balanced with a sense of, when we all adhere to certain social agreements, everybody benefits. And when everybody benefits, when more people do well, it's a stronger, happier society, and that even though, say, some people may have to pay more in taxes than others, those taxes go to things that create more well-being for everyone, which eventually, helps, even the people who are paying more into the system because they can. But again, I'm not trying to advocate a value system here. We're more trying to look at how certain value systems lead to certain shadows and problems and how they might be corrected. But certainly there could be other ways. I'll just say one last thing about what I said about sort of what we said about toxic positivity or positive psychology. I think approaches to psychology and spirituality and self development that combine ways of being happy, ways of being positive and aspirational. Because I really believe that envisioning positive things for yourself is sometimes very important to self development. And there's some people certainly that suffer because they can't do that. So I do think it has a place. But I think we also need to include what's unconscious, what's painful, what's negative, and in some way it might mean including the shadow. So approaches to self development and psychological health that include being positive and aspirational with working through trauma, pain, suffering. Because if we don't, it persists. It doesn't go away. We can't just shove it under the carpet. Okay, that does it for our collective shadow. In fact, our whole shadow series. We hope you have gotten something out of this. We really think it's important to talk about the shadow. But now it's time for our top five, as you say. So let's go there.
And what's our top five today?
Today, we're talking about the top five types that find it hard to retire or quit their job.
Hmm. Yeah, interesting one. What is your number five?
I think you think it's interesting because you thought of it.
Well, I like
But
the
it is
theme.
interesting.
I like the theme. Yeah.
It is. It's interesting.
Yeah,
Okay, so you want me to start with my top
please.
5?
Yeah,
My
I'm
number 5.
curious. Yes.
So my number 5 type that finds it hard to retire, quit, is 6.
Oh,
And I think sixes could go either way, but I do think sometimes sixes have a hard time retiring or quitting out of fear. Fear that they won't have enough to sustain themselves, fear that they, you know, will run out of resources, but also sometimes a sense of responsibility and a kind of a little bit of getting addicted to being the one that needs to be there to solve the problems or reduce the threats or keep everybody safe. I'm thinking a little bit more of self-preservation and social sixes, but I think it could be also some sexual sixes as well. But that's my number 5. What's yours?
well, I have a draw, so I cheated on this one, as you used to say. And the draw is between six, but especially social, and one. These are my top five. I think that ones, on one hand, they end up being like unreplaceable because of the ways they work, and they think that they need to be there to make things right, and at the same time they have a good understanding that it's fair to be able to retire and to stop and to move on, and they are courageous in general, so they are not among my top three, for instance. But what is your
Wow, it's
number?
amazing.
Ah, yes.
It's amazing that you had a tie. I struggled to find 5 and you found at least
Ah,
6.
yeah. Let's see the other ones. What's your fourth?
My 4th um is type 8.
And why?
And here I think it's because, you know, eights work super hard. And I think they often get a lot of energy and juice out of hard work and meeting challenges and being the ones to make things happen and being in action. And I think sometimes it's hard for them to give that up. You know, especially if they like what they're doing. Might be different if they don't like what they're doing. But I think sometimes eights get a lot out of, especially if they're in a position of power and they're doing something they like doing and they're having a lot of influence and making positive things happen. I think sometimes they can get a little bit too into the heroic mindset of being the strong person who does a lot. So I have 8 as my number 4.
So do I. And for all the reasons that you said, but also because of power. And at work, eights usually get to a power position that internally their egos like. And also, they put themselves in the position of being the providers and so forth. So it's hard
Mhm.
to quit.
Yeah.
What is your third?
My third is, and here I went with a subtype, is self preservation 4.
Hmm,
Because
interesting.
I think sometimes self-preservation fours, they're probably the fours that like go into action the most and have a hard time not being active. It's almost like they act out instead of feeling envy, they are trying to prove themselves, trying to be active to get what they need and want or to prove themselves worthy. Also, it's the shadow of masochism. I think sometimes self-pres fours stay with work even if they don't like it, especially if they're needed by others or what they're doing is something they see as helping others. I think they often have a hard time putting, say, their own needs and wants to stop working as a priority.
Mhm. Well, my third is type 2. I see in practice many Jews that postpone retirement, and especially social Jews, but not only. I think it's hard for some Jews to quit or retire when they feel that they are super important for that group of people, for whatever they are doing, if they're getting recognition. So I just think that in practice, empirically, I've seen many Jews struggle with that. What is your
Interesting. I don't have twos on my list.
second?
Maybe you've identified a blind spot of mine.
Oh, okay, okay.
It's funny because I sometimes think of twos as describing themselves, but I think this is more self-preservation twos, if I'm honest, as being lazy. And I
Hmm.
feel that way myself. Like
Yeah.
I like to have a good time. I look very much forward to the times of not working. But that said, I think you're right, and I think especially if they're in a position in which they're getting their pride is getting a lot out of it. I think you're right, and so I wouldn't. I'm not disagreeing with you, but two's not on my list. So maybe I have to look into that.
Okay. What's your second?
My second is one.
Ah.
I think ones, both because they're super hard workers, because in some ways, I think they get into positions where the job is never done because it can always be better, or they haven't reached the ideal yet, or they're needed in some way, or they're duty bound. I think there are a lot of different factors that I see that make it hard for ones to step aside and let go of whatever they're doing to work on things.
Oh.
And I also think ones might be people, and here I'm thinking of my dad, so maybe it's too small of a
Mhm.
sample size. But I think some ones are people, I think, after they like formally retire from a job, like maybe they get to the age or it makes sense in some ways, they start doing something else. And maybe that is a different job, but they can often spend as much energy and time and focus on it as if it was their job. So I think that may not be technically part of the definition of the top five, but I think I was thinking along those lines as well.
I reserved my second place and the silver medal to all self preservation dominants of all types.
I think that's cheating again,
No,
or
it's
maybe it's
not.
being creative.
It's just a very big opinion I have and experience that, but in seeing that all self-pressed dominants find it way harder to move on, like to
Hmm.
change positions in a company, to quit, to do their own business, or even to retire. Am I really capable of retiring? Do I need more money first? So I think there is this conservation aspect of self-pressed dominance that make this harder for them.
That's so interesting. I want to present another side to this, but it's purely based on me. Don't want to make this all about me,
Yeah.
but it's so interesting because and again, I may have to look at this because I really was thinking of myself as not on this list in any way as a two or a self-pres dominant.
Hmm.
Now, again, I'm not saying I definitely could have a blind spot here, but one of the things, for instance, when I was younger and I was working at a Monday through Friday 9 to 5 job, I hated it. I couldn't stand it. And again, that may be sort of idiosyncratic about me, but like Sunday nights, I would get depressed.
Hmm.
Now, and it wasn't a horrible job. I'm not saying I was. There's a lot of worse jobs than what I was doing. I was basically working in radio and television, and but it was really interesting. And for me, it was the feeling that I would get on Sundays that made me look for ways to quit. Now, but again, maybe that's a really idiosyncratic example. Maybe I'm weird. Maybe I've got a blind spot here. But yeah, I'm just adding that in because it's interesting that you have self preservations of all kinds. But I don't relate to that. But like I said, I'm not saying you're wrong.
Yeah. I think I should say self-preservations in general, not all self-presses.
How
But
about self preservations except for self pres twos?
okay. Okay, I'll give you that because then you'll be happier. Yes.
I've
Okay.
known a lot of self-pres twos who are only too happy to be supported
Yeah.
by their parents or their
Yeah.
former spouses, for
You're
instance.
probably right. Yes, you're probably right. Yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
so I believe we have the same type on the first place.
Yes, type
Yeah.
3.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Do you
Probably
wanna
doesn't need much explanation.
Yeah, because and also I see a pattern on threes, like sportsmen who are threes. They quit and then they come back. Like
Mm,
Michael Jordan,
yes.
so many threes, and it's very, very, very hard to stop. And but in terms of quitting their jobs, I don't think it's as hard when they're being successful, but there aren't as many challenges anymore. So if
Or
things have
or
been done, yeah,
or when they find something else to do
yeah,
that might make them more successful or represents a new challenge or a new goal.
yeah. I think I based my choice for type 3 more in how hard it is for them to retire, not
Right. That
necessarily
makes
to
sense.
quit their jobs, but
Yeah. Yeah.
if there are better challenges out there. But I also do see that threes tend to be the most loyal people within a company or even in a sports team. They stay for longer because they want to make a career there and be the ones that will be known for being big examples in that particular culture, will be remembered always. Just see that perhaps mostly with social threes.
I also think that sometimes threes have a distorted view when it comes to how much work is too much. And
Hmm.
for instance, I've coached threes who um, got sick, like got cancer or some serious illness, and they got treatment, they made some changes in their lives, but eventually went back to work and were working as much as they were before, even while they were kind of telling themselves they had cut back. And when at one point, I just would ask them, like, okay, let's try to be objective here. Are you still working too hard? It was really hard to step away. And I think one reason why there's many reasons why it's hard for threes to step away or to quit or to retire is I think often their identity and their sense of who they are and their sense of being loved or appreciated by others rests on their work identity.
Hmm.
And it's sort of like, if I quit this job, who will I be? And I also think it can seem to be really scary to quit a job and have nothing to do. So I think there's a lot of reasons why threes are the number one on this list.
Yeah, and having said that, I want to mention that I see in our students and clients that when threes do inner work, very commonly they quit their jobs. When they are
Yes.
doing really well in inner work, many times, but not always, they feel it's incompatible to stay because they have built a big persona out of that position they had, and they just feel it becomes incompatible.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because I think what we're talking about here is threes either who haven't done inner work or before they've done inner work.
Right.
Because I totally agree. I think when threes do inner work, which is why it can be so scary for threes to do really deep inner work, is because sometimes they realize they don't like what they're doing, and they're missing out on other things they'd rather be doing. And it was hard to see that or feel that or admit that before they did the work that they did to come to know more of their own depths.
Yeah, or they don't like who they have become in that thing that they do. So
Right.
yeah,
Right.
good one. Good top five.
Okay, well, that does it for this episode. We want to thank you for listening, and I want to invite you to join us again for our next Enneagram 2.0 podcast, where we talk about all things Enneagram.